Happy's Garage is brought to you today by the letters P, B, and the number 3. Make sure when you're working underneath your car to use PB Blaster 3 times a day for 3 days before attempting to remove any of those bolts and nuts.
Guess what time it is? It's time to pull out the rear suspension, including those awesome 1970s air shocks, and the rear differential. First thing we got to do is get in here and loosen the bolts for the differential and get it drained. Now notice here, I did not pull all the bolts out. I pulled out 5 on the bottom and I left the top ones in place. So that way the fluid can drain, but the diff cover stays in place. I don't want all of it coming out at once, right? Be smart. Okay, so I got the differential drained, and the only thing that's connecting it hose-wise is the brake line. And since I'm replacing all this, I went ahead and cut that line. There's still a little bit of fluid left in it, so I just set up a milk jug underneath it to catch the drips. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to jack up the rear end and put it on stands. So here's the thing. Before we jack up the rear end and put it on jack stands, first things first, I need to position the car where I need it in the garage. Sorry for the bad lighting. I can't help the sun. So I got to position the car where I need it because once that rear axle comes off, it ain't going nowhere, right? First thing, position the car. Second, chock the front tires so I don't have to worry about front end going anywhere on me. All right, so now we got the back end up in the air on jack stands. Take the wheels off first, jack it up, put it on jack stands. Don't do like I did. I jacked it up, forgot to take the wheels off. I was fortunate, there was only 2 lug nuts holding each wheel on, and they were fairly loose, so yay for me. Loosen your lug nuts, jack it up, put it on jack stands. Now the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to take off the bottom nut on the shock itself. And let me show you this while we're at it. Do not be surprised if the shock wants to turn when you turn the bolt, right? It's easy to see because these awesome air shocks, right? So what you're going to have to do is find some way to hold the air shock in place while you undo that bolt, or hold the shock. You may not have air shocks. You might not be that awesome. This car is. So anyway, you may want to find a place like a locking pair of pliers or something to hold that shock in place while you're trying to undo that bolt. Okay, getting that off was fun. Note, if you put a jack stand under the differential to hold it up, or maybe even your jack, just don't put any pressure on it, it'll relieve the pressure on that shock screw, and it'll probably make it just a little bit easier to get out. I didn't do that, and when the bolt came off, the whole thing dropped a little bit. So that's something you can put under there just to make life a little bit easier for you. Now what we have to do is we have to take off the perch bolts here. Okay, now that we've got those perch bolts out, now what we've got to do is work our way up to the front of the spring. And here we're going to take out these 3 bolts, one here, and there's another one tucked up behind here. We're going to put a jack under the eye, under the front of the spring, so that way it doesn't fall down. All right, and this is what you should end up with. After you remove the front bolts from the spring perch, from the front spring perch, what should happen is it should let go, and it might take some coaxing, you know, mine did, but then again, I mean, the car's been sitting since '92. So, but anyway, now that the front spring is completely loose, there's no tension on it whatsoever, now we can move to the back. Okay, now that we've gotten the front undone, now we're going to come to the back of the car and take the back off. Now, there's 1 bolt here on the bottom that locks the spring in through the shackle. But you'll notice, if you take that bolt off, then that nut off, that entire bolt has to come out this way. Oh wait, the gas tank is supposed to be here. So swapping out these rear springs is almost impossible. If the gas tank is in, So it's another reason to pull the gas tank first. All right, now that we're done with the driver's side, we're going to move to the passenger side. Rinse and repeat. Remove the bottom nut from the shock first. Remove the perch bolts right underneath the rear axle. Take that plate off. Move to the front. Put a jack under the front end of the spring. Remove the 3 bolts on the front perch. Come back here to the back after you've removed the tension. And then take the rear spring out. You're all set. Hey guys, know what I forgot to do? Disconnect the emergency brake line. So what you can do is turn that little stud in there sideways and inside that spring, and it'll loosen up the brakes so that they can come off. Let me get those off and I'll show you what comes next. Okay, now that the brakes are loose, I'm gonna unhook these springs to get them off of this stud here, so all the drum brake assembly comes out. All right, now that the drum brake assembly is off, is down here at the bottom where the emergency brake comes in. 2 of these little pins have to come in to allow the emergency brake cable to come out. You can use a hose clamp. I'm using needle nose pliers. All right, so let me show you what's going on here, right? These little pins, now that it's out, it's easier to see. Those pins flare outward like this, right? To help keep it in place here, okay? So what you gotta do is squeeze those pins in to get them through the hole. Needle nose pliers, you can get away with it. Hose clamp, now that I've done it, I really like that idea a whole lot better. Because it squeezes them all at once. Once they're squeezed in and you can push it through, then you can loosen up the hose clamp and take it off to finish taking it out. But now that the emergency brake cable's off on both sides, now all I gotta do is pull the rear end out of the car, and I can get up in here and pull the screws out, and now my shocks are out, rear end's out. I haven't pulled the leaf springs just yet out of the rear because those bolts are really frozen, so I'm going to get a clamp to push the bolt through. But anyway, it's a whole lot of fun. It's taken probably 2 hours worth of work, I guess, and that's with a really rusted rear end. So anyway, have fun with it. I'm going to update the comments in the article about it, about some things I think might be easier. Instead of starting in the middle, going to the front, and then going to the back, I think it may be easier to loosen up that nut in the back first, because what happens is that shackle wants to move if you put any pressure on it, and that becomes a challenge, right? So I think the best thing to do may be to remove the nut here first, then come down and you can get the main perch and then down to the front if you want. Okay, real quick, now that the rear end's out, it's a whole lot easier to get to and see the stamp on the passenger side forward facing axle, so we can decode the rear end. You'll notice the first 2 letters on mine are GZ, which means that it's a 273 open. Okay, the next letter G indicates the plant that it was built in. Mine was built at the Detroit Gear and Axle plant. The next 3 numbers are important. 260. That means this rear end was built on the 260th day of the year. Now, my car was built the first week of December. Okay, so the rear end was built before the car. So this rear end should be the rear end that came in the car from the factory. If my car was built the first week of December, but the build date for the rear end, for the engine, or for the transmission comes after that, let's say 360, 358, whatever, then odds are that engine, that transmission, that rear end did not come in that car originally. The last number that you're going to see there is a 2. That means it was built on a night shift. Day shift gets either a D or a 1. Night shift gets an N or a 2. There you go. That's how to decode a rear end. Visit the guys at nastyz28.com for further decoding to figure out other gear ratio stamps, other manufacturing plant stamps as well. And I think that's going to do it. Leave me some comments below if you got any questions, and we'll see you on the next one.